Have you ever found that words, particularly verbs, but sometimes nouns as well, change and you're wondering what happened? Or perhaps you already know about how stops merge with sigmas and you're trying to remember the square of stops. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about the square of stops, when you're going to encounter the need for it, and exactly why you see these changes take place. So this is more of a grammar video. We're going to get into some of the details of morphology. So let's do that and get into it. All right, so let's look at this on the computer. First of all, let's talk about the sort of things you're going to see. You know the word baptizo, right? To mean to baptize. And then you come across it in places like Mark 1 verse 8, you know, I baptize you with water, right? Now, in this case, you've got ibaptiza, which is not ibaptizo. So the question is, how did baptizo become ibaptiza, right? What happened here to change the word? Well, it's pretty straightforward. There are, first of all, several different components to creating a Greek verb. We have the stem. The stem is where we get the basic notion of the meaning of the word. It takes the root of the word and then, for the most part, modifies it, at least in the present tense stem primarily. You get some modifications of the root in the present stem, and that is your lexical form, if you like. That's the root is then called a stem when it's found in this particular tense form. So in the present tense, it's the present tense stem. Based on a root, perhaps might be the same as the root, might be different, always the same in the aorist, but the stem is called the stem because it's that form of the root in that particular tense stem. Then we have our personal endings. Now, you know, with personal endings, we have person involved in it, which means first person, second person, third person, first person, second person, and third person, someone else not in this conversation. We have number, singular and plural. And then we have primary and secondary endings depending on the nature of the word. And then on top of that, of course, we have active endings and we have middle passive endings, and it sounds really confusing, but really it's just a quadrant. And if you remember that quadrant, you're all good. We'll deal with that another time. So you have your personal ending that goes on the verb as well. You also have your augment. Now, ibaptiza, as we saw before, has that epsilon on the front. That's called an augment. And now the augment always goes on a verb that uses secondary ending. So if the verb is going to add a secondary ending like ibaptiza does, then you're going to end up with an augment on the front of it, okay? And then finally you have your tense formative or your connecting vowel, and this connects directly to the stem, and this is therefore the place you're most likely to need the square of stops. And this is really where you're going to see this change of letters take place. Let me explain this to you. When we have a word that ends in a stop, now you might say, well, what is a stop? Well, a stop is simply a letter that slows down or stops completely the flow of air from the mouth. And there are three different classes of stops with three different kinds of stops that they all take. Now, you don't have to memorize all of these or anything like that. You just have to be aware of them. There are, for instance, labials. Now, labials are the letters that use the lips, okay? So the p, b, and f. Right, so each of those are going to use either one or both of the lips. So they either stop the air flowing through and then release it again, like the P and the beta, or they're going to slow the air down so that you can hear it as it goes through, like the phi, okay? There's also velars, also called palatals. Now, these use the upper part of your mouth to slow down or stop the flow of air. So this is your kappa, your gamma, and your chi, right? All using much the same part of the top of the roof of the mouth to do that work. And again, same kind of thing. They either stop it and release it, or they're just going to slow it down significantly. And then there's dentals, which use the teeth, okay? So this is your tau, your delta, and your theta. These all use different parts of the teeth again, and again, they either slow down or stop the air flowing through behind the teeth, right? So that's the names of them, and that's what they're called. And these are the letters that are going to interact with a sigma, particularly in a tense formative. And so we have a number of tense formatives that use a sigma in them. For instance, we have the aorist tense formative, and in the aorist tense formative, you get that sigma alpha, and then there's the future, sigma omicron, okay? Now, when a word ends in a stop, and one of these tense formatives runs up against it, that's where you're going to see the changes to these words that we're going to look at now. Let's look at these by category. For instance, we see a labial like blepo. Now, blepo is one of those nice words that has the same root in the aorist as it does in the present stem. And so you have here, when we put this in the aorist, you have the epsilon goes on the front because we're using, in this case, a third person plural secondary ending. That's the nu, right? And then we get the stem, which is blep. Okay, it's just the root and the aorist. And then the sigma alpha tense formative. Now, when the P and the sigma tense of the tense formative can come together, that's when you get this change. And you see in this case, the P sound and the sigma sound have simply merged together, if you like. Fortunately, Greek has a letter for this, which is the psi, and the psi then takes the place of both those two letters. We see the same thing with velas as well. So argo is a great example of this, to lead, to guide. And you can see here we get the arg root, we put this in the future, and we get the sigma omicron tense formative, and then we end up with no ending, at least in the first person singular. And so we get uxo, okay? So the gamma plus the sigma come together, and of course the xi, that letter that we've got here that you can see in blue and uxo, that's a single letter that combines both those, that g or k, that vela kind of feel, if you like, with a sigma, and so you merge those two together. And the same happens with the dental as well. We get the epsilon goes on the front. This is in the aorist, third person plural, just like with the labial there. And you get baptizo. Now, baptizo is an interesting word in the sense that the root actually ends in a delta, but in the present tense that delta turns into a zeta. And the interesting thing about these is these zeta verbs tend to be quite causative often, so causing someone to be dipped, if you like. And so baptizo, and don't read too much into that, but so baptizo, so you get the epsilon plus you get that stem, baptid, right? And then you get the sigma alpha tense formative, then your secondary ending, and you end up with ibaptisan. Now you can see in this case that delta has pretty much dropped out entirely and been replaced with the sigma, and that's what happens in the dentals, right? And you can sort of think about that a little bit and you can sort of understand it because, well, you form the sigma, the sound of the sigma, by putting your tongue in much the same place that you do for the dentals. So it's pretty straightforward to remember that your tau, delta, or your theta is going to turn into a sigma if you think about it that way. So there's a whole chart of this which you'll find in just about every beginning Greek grammar, and it's worth noting that it's actually not something you necessarily need to memorize, okay? But looking at this, as you start it, you go across from the left to right and you can see the different labials, the different velas or palatals, and the different dentals. And you'll notice that when you get to this first column, the unvoiced, P, kappa, and tau, when you pronounce the sound of the word, you actually don't use your voice. You're just letting your mouth do the work. So p, k, and t, right? You don't actually have to add anything to that. If you did, it's probably going to turn into one of the voiced versions. So a b, beta, or g, gamma, or d, delta. And you have to add a little bit of your voice to that. And then the aspirates, really they don't use any voice, but they're slowing the air down rather than stopping it. So a phi, a ki, a f, k, or a th, theta. Okay, so in each of those, they're unvoiced as well, but again, the air is flowing rather than stopping, okay? Now with each of these, and this is the key point of the square of stops, is that what takes place when you have a sigma plus a labial, vela, or dental is going to be consistent in each of those different cases. You're going to have the same results. So every time a sigma and a labial come together, it's going to form a psi. Every time a vela and a sigma come together, you're going to get a xi. And every time a dental and a labial comes together, it's going to just drop that t sound and you're going to end up just with a sigma sound. And so it's pretty consistent. So the whole point of this is not something to necessarily memorize as much as just something to recognize that there are consistent patterns here. And I actually recommend that rather than memorize this, you just get a copy, put it on your wall, put it somewhere where you can see it during the beginning Greek phase so you can just refer to it. But you'll probably find that pretty quickly you don't actually need to remember it or refer to it anymore, in which case take it down and just refer to it in a book when you need to. All right. When do you need to know the square of stops? Why is this important? Well, you're going to run into it a reasonably large amount of times. It's quite surprising how often you find this. You find it, for instance, when you're looking at aorist active forms. And this could be in the indicative, could be in the subjunctive, and it could be with participles. You'll often find it with participles. In fact, anything where you've got a sigma alpha or sigma omicron tense formative, you're going to find that. So that's your aorists, that's your futures. Basically, whenever you're in those two different tense forms, and it doesn't matter what the form is, as long as it takes a sigma omicron or sigma omega in the case of subjunctive, you're going to find the square of stops is going to be at work in this. You find this in the future, like I mentioned, future active forms, not in the future passive, because of course in the future passive, actually you'll find it in the future middle as well, but in the future passive, of course, it's going to be the theta, eta, sigma tense formative, not the sigma tense formative. You'll also find it in third declensions, and this is in nouns, not verbs, right? So we've talked about it in verbs, but you're going to find it in nouns, particularly in verbs ending in a kappa, such as sark, okay, which if you look at this in the dative plural is sarksin. You'll find it in words that end with that mu, alpha, tau, in words ending in mat, so pneumatos, for instance, and you'll find there that when that hits the dative plural, it'll be pneumasin, and again, what's happened there is that that tau on the ending of the word has just dropped out and the sigma has replaced it because the ending, the dative plural ending, is sigma and iota with a movable nu. So that sigma iota merges into the tau, and of course the tau just drops out like it does with every other dental, and it becomes a sigma sound. And then of course you'll find it when you come across delta tau words as well, charis. For instance, you'll find it when you get charis, grace, right? You'll see there that the ending of this word, the root of it is actually charit, right? With that tau on the end. And of course, the dative plural again, sigma iota with a movable nu, is going to overrule that tau and drop it out. So again, it's pretty consistent. And as long as you know what the root of the word is or the noun, you'll be able to identify what's taken place in there. You're also going to find this in participles, and the reason for that is basically you've got tense formatives, right? And the sigma alpha tense formative and the very rare sigma omicron future tense formative, you're going to come across this. So if you're used to a regular participle, luo, you will know that the sigma alpha tense formative in the aorist active participle is going to be there. Lusasin, again in the dative plural. And the same thing takes place with baptizo as well, where you're going to end up with baptisasi. So the square of stops is important, but it's not one of those things I'd necessarily work on committing to memory, although it's interesting because Mounts requires you to remember all of his noun rules, and this is his 8th noun rule. But others, such as Merkel and Plummer, say just review it and become familiar with it. And that's kind of more my position as well. Just review it, be familiar with it, put it somewhere where you can refer to it if you need to. But for the most part, these are just consistent patterns you should start getting used to seeing. You'll want to see this when you first learn it, but beyond that, it should be pretty straightforward. So I hope this has been a helpful video. I'd love to hear if you've had experience with this and what the difficult words you've encountered with the square of stops has been. Leave a comment below, or if there's something like this you'd like me to cover in the future, then leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll look at doing that in the future as well. Thanks so much for watching. And if you are interested in learning Greek, because some of this material is covered in my beginning, all of this, but just not all in the same place, is covered in our beginning Greek course, just don't forget to download our roadmap at bma.to/roadmap, and we look forward to serving you and being a blessing to you and helping you to see the New Testament in a completely new light through the original languages. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Till then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. See you then.